Hi, my name is Daniel, I really love movies, and today I'm going to rank the entire Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. Okay, I think this is going to be my most divisive or controversial list. Out of all the big horror franchises, this has to be my least favorite, and that seems to be a general consensus. There also seems to be a general consensus on how to rank these two, but let me go ahead and warn you, I'm going to have some very hot takes. Maybe I'm being a little dramatic here, but from what I've also gathered, this seems to be a pretty close-minded franchise on what you can think. I guess you'll see what I'm talking about when we get to it, so without further ado, this is just my opinion. I'd love to hear yours down in the comments, but here's my ranking. In 9th place is going to be the Nightmare on Elm Street remake from 2010. I wouldn't just say this is the worst of the series, but also the worst horror remake. It's one of those remakes that's nearly shot for shot and both tries and fails to compensate with its flashier, higher budget. This movie is just extremely dry, if not completely depressing. And just so you know, when I call horror or any movies depressing, in this case, I don't mean that the plot is necessarily depressing, but rather there's little to nothing that energizes or engages me. Or something like that. Maybe someone knows what I'm trying to say. But anyway, from a remake perspective, yeah, this is just an empty, soulless retread of the original that the thing was actually had potential that they more than wasted. I'm in the possible camp of those who thinks that Katie Cassidy very much should have been the lead. She was not only a pretty established scream queen at this point, but also, clearly, a lot more in tune with the genre than the otherwise lifeless lead was. The point I'm trying to make though, with how Tina in the original, which the character of Chris is obviously supposed to represent, was presented to us as the lead but killed, they should have taken that opposite direction here. But of course, being the horror remake trend, we just couldn't stray that far from the original. Speaking of straying though, if there was one thing that wasn't better but unique in its own right in this version, it was the new Freddy Krueger. Just to be clear, not the problematic backstory that yes, they wanted to do in the original and ended up doing here, but entirely the new actor in the role. Obviously, no one will ever compare to Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger, but Jackie Earle Haley was a pretty worthy successor. He really brought his own in a role that had some pretty big shoes to fill. Still, I will always prefer Robert Englund as Freddy, and this is a horror movie in general that I will rarely, if ever, be inclined to rewatching. In 8th place is going to be Freddy's Dead, The Final Nightmare. When I had first watched this, even aware of all the hate it got, I decided to go into this as kindly as possible, even with my also already personal disdain for the franchise. While that first watch was definitely a drag, I didn't and still don't outright hate this one as many people do. It's not without its flaws, which there are a lot of course, but I can genuinely have some fun with this one. For one, some of that over-the-top humor actually kind of worked for me and just made sense, but only at this point in the franchise. I also don't mind how they explored Freddy Krueger's backstory in this one. I wouldn't say it was genius, but one of the more interesting aspects of this movie. Of course, however, I think it would have landed much better if they'd set it up in the earlier movies. And speaking of the earlier movies, the biggest flaw is how far removed this one feels from those said other movies. There's no returning characters from the other ones, and these new ones are perhaps the most forgettable. This one really just exists in its own world, and yeah, is that last-ditch effort parody installment of the series. As much as I've at least somewhat come around to this one, and would maybe be inclined to rewatch it for some fun, I think it will always be this low. In 7th place, and yes, this might be my first hot take, is going to be Wes Craven's New Nightmare. This one's usually put a lot higher on people's list, and while I can understand to some degree, for the most part, I personally don't understand the hype around this one. I mean, sure, it may have been some type of a return to form, especially at this point in the 90s, but the point I'm trying to make is that I feel like it gets too much credit. Like Freddy's Dead, I went into this knowing all the praise it got, and while I wasn't necessarily disappointed, I was nonetheless underwhelmed and just didn't see it. Also, I was even more excited going into this one, seeing how it was described as this prototype of Scream, which is my favorite scary movie, also directed by Wes Craven, and I think that's where I was the most underwhelmed. I was just expecting it to be more like it. I was just hoping that it would have have the same fun and energy as it. I guess there really was a good reason this was considered a prototype. Even after rewatching this one with all that in mind, I just didn't and still don't really vibe with this story. The idea of Freddy Krueger, or this entity similar to him, being loose in the real world is a pretty good, if not solid idea. I just wasn't a fan of the execution. I just feel like things moved way too slowly at times, and that they could have done more than what we ultimately got. Getting into the positives though, I really loved seeing Heather Langenkamp, who carries this movie, come back, as well as the other cameos, and again, some of those meta aspects they were going for. Like I said, if only they had been executed better. I mean, I don't hate or even strongly dislike this one. Really, I think I would have had to have just been there for this movie. Because, last but not least, I can still appreciate and see how this, one way or another, set up the groundwork for and gave us Scream. But in 6th place, and this feels like an even hotter take, is going to be A Nightmare on Elm Street 5: The Dream Child. Honestly, it'd be such a massive understatement to say how this one really grew on me. Trying to keep things as spoiler free as possible. If you've seen it, you know what I'm talking about. But for the longest time, I hated this one choice they made in this movie. It tarnished all the good of the previous movie, which this one feels like an unnecessary and dull copy and paste of, most specifically in the characters. And this might sound very specific, but when I first watched this, I was also actively binging the show Full House, and all I could see in the new character, Jacob, was the character of Walter or Duckface. I didn't realize until I watched this one either that he was also the 6-foot turkey kid in Jurassic Park. Yes, New Nightmare had one of the Full House kids too, but it didn't really take me out of the movie as much. Anyways, setting all that aside though, this is an example of a movie where once I gave it my all after so many unpleasant watches where it was hard to keep my attention, I was able to get more out of it. And that was the strong character growth of Alice, with another strong performance by Lisa Wilcox that I honestly really slept on, no pun intended. I was just stunned on how this was able to bring it higher for me. I think it's what actually might redeem that bad choice they made, to be honest. It doesn't and never will justify it, but I'm glad I finally found some good with this movie. And why it's higher than New Nightmare? Well, it still has that 80s charm and of course, plenty of energy. If there's anything I love about this series, it's those qualities. But in 5th place is going to be A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge. There's a whole lot that me or anyone can say about this movie. I'd say that out of the whole franchise, even though it's not necessarily regarded as terrible, it still has quite the divide. Me, I don't love this movie, but nonetheless have a lot of appreciation for it. For one, there was a time in my life where I could very much relate to the character of Jesse. Trust me, I'm never gonna make this a big deal on here, but as a gay man, I was really in tune with what they were going for. Especially watching this for the first time while I was still in the closet, at the point where I really started to grasp that part of me. I think it really hits with the themes and horrors of not being able to be true to yourself. And what made that stick and that time of my life even darker is how this doesn't really end on the best note. This is the one that's depressing as in the actual mood. It's not so much a slog to get through, but for the most part, feels like a bad, wet fever dream, or in this case, nightmare. All the negatives aside though, and the one thing I think we can all agree on, is how for a horror sequel, especially one that came out in the 80s and just under a year after the original, it absolutely works. It doesn't copy the original, and I think that the possession storyline was an interesting next step, especially considering the themes. What I like the most, again, especially for an 80s slasher movie, is how this gives us not the first, but a rare example of the male Scream Queen. Anyways, and even more, I think this might have the scariest Freddy Krueger, to be honest. Not just in the performance, but the makeup and even the special effects here were just absolutely visceral. This might be the scariest one in general, with the occasional and welcome contrast of this particular sense of humor that I'm not entirely sure how to describe, but for the most part actually kind of works for me. While I don't think I ever really disliked this movie, there's just not enough to bring it any higher for me, but not any lower. In fourth place is going to be A Nightmare on Elm Street 3, The Dream Warriors. This one was the trickiest place, to be honest. Depending on my mood, this one could be higher or lower some days, but never in between. Not to sound negative, I don't hate this movie, but I think it's almost as overrated as New Nightmare, but at least has a lot more going for it that I can vibe with. For one, but at the same time, what I think people give it too much credit for, I think this one has the best kills and special effects out of the series, and not the most, but more energy than the previous movie. I really vibed with the concept here too, with all these kids who become known as the Dream Warriors getting all these dream powers. Even more, I grew up as that loser kid that most of them come off as, and like I've mentioned before, I just love stories of people, especially teens in this case, coming together. It gave this one a lot, if not the most, emotional stakes that I go super back and forth, but mostly back, on if they paid off or not. Coming at you with what might be hot takes, but I think that a lot of the interesting characters, especially the survivors, are either underdeveloped or killed off. All that being said, by the end, this one just leaves me with not a sour, but a bitter taste in my mouth. Regardless, I think there's still plenty to like about this one. More importantly, how it sets up the high energy going into the rest of the series, or of the original series anyway. But circling back to the earlier point of this one being overrated, at least I can watch this one and, unlike New Nightmare, at least have some fun with it and not necessarily be disappointed or even underwhelmed. In third place is going to be Freddy vs. Jason. To be fair, this and Dream Warriors tend to go back and forth sometimes. Like Dream Warriors, this was almost trickier to place, considering that this is, of course, also a crossover with the Friday the 13th franchise. And if you couldn't tell from the shirt I wore to this outdoor fan screening event of the movie I went to last year, that I also mentioned in my Friday the 13th ranking you can check out, I pull up to this movie more for Jason, even if it's oddly more of a nightmare film than a Friday the 13th film. Truthfully, I think that the only negative I can give this movie from a nightmare perspective is the characters. It's not that they're insufferable, but they're definitely way more like Friday the 13th characters, and that they feel way more like cliche teenagers as opposed to the more stronger ones we always got in the nightmare movies. But in all honesty, that is an almost microscopic gripe, because regardless of which movie you pull up for, we're all really here to just see Freddy and Jason go at it, which this movie absolutely delivers on. What I appreciate this one even more for, considering both franchises, especially on the Nightmare side, is how entry level this movie is. Like I mentioned in my Friday the 13th ranking, this is the first I watched of either franchise, at a time when I was really starting to get into horror. That still holds up, especially and possibly even more on the Nightmare side. The intro alone with Freddy Krueger, not just one of my favorite horror movie intros, but what I think is a great reintroduction to the character of Freddy Krueger, which, speaking of, and most importantly, this movie feels like a highlight reel of, not just to all the variations of Freddy throughout the years, but to all of Robert Englund's acting chops. This movie was nothing more and nothing less, except, in the bigger picture, this epic battle between these two horror icons. In second place, and this might be a spicy take considering my number one, is going to be the original Nightmare on Elm Street. Now, do I think this is a classic? Absolutely. Comparing this to earlier slashers especially, a genre which had been mainstream at this point, this felt like something new in a plethora of ways. What really stands out to me about this one, compared to those said earlier slashers, is how strong Wes Craven truly made the characters. And not just the not-so-standard final girl in this case, but even who could have read as the otherwise horny teenagers or young adults, made to feel deserving of death because of the fact, were a lot more fleshed out and written as real people. Even more, this was probably the first, or certainly the strongest example, of a slasher film to have a deeper theme or message of both being misunderstood by and challenging authority. It's most definitely the strongest out of this series, and one that, when I was a teenager in high school and just growing up in general, I can relate to the most. I was definitely a Nancy, one of the strongest final girls in horror, played by the amazing Heather Langenkamp, who I've met and got to sign my box set. I've even met Robert Englund too, who of course brought to life a new type of slasher villain, Freddy Krueger. While this is such a classic that I will always love and appreciate for what it did for the genre, this was very much just an introduction, not a proof of concept, and certainly the best made film out of the series with the strongest script. At the end of the day though, it just doesn't hit that same level with how I ultimately feel about my next pick, which, speaking of, in first place, and this is going to be very spicy, is going to be A Nightmare on Elm Street 4, The Dream Master. Look, I just want to start off and say that if a majority of people can put Dream Warriors ahead of the original, I can put this one here. It might not be the most well-regarded opinion, and I might be the first person to say it out loud, but here's the thing, it's just an opinion. My opinion, and it's not right, and you're not wrong about how you feel. I might be blowing this out of proportion more than I need to be, but all I know is my personal experience, not on here, but on other platforms, where I shared what people would call unpopular opinions. People can feel very strongly about those said opinions. I really don't want to rant, but I also know that with the other horror franchises I'm going to be covering, I'm going to have some very different opinions, to say the least. I just have my own taste. Very strange taste, but still, my taste. And I might not be the only person like this, but the point is, or what I'm trying to say, if you have an unpopular opinion that you're too afraid to share, consider me your voice, because maybe someone else is out there who might share this opinion, and or has even hotter takes that they want to share but just don't feel like they can. I mean, it's not that people necessarily hate this specific movie either, but like I said in the beginning, there just seems to be a close-minded way to rank this franchise. But, like I also said, and maybe it's kind of ironic, where I really clicked with the theme of challenging authority in the first movie, I guess I'd like to challenge these so-called popular opinions. Not invalidate them, just challenge them. Okay, to wrap up what could possibly be this very unnecessary tangent, look at it this way. If Freddy's Dead was your favorite, yeah, maybe I'd raise an eyebrow, and I'm sure everyone else would too, but I'd listen to you and be happy for you. It's all about respect. Sorry if that was a little dramatic, but anyway, and finally getting into my thoughts with this one, plain and simple, I just really fucking love this movie. I mean, just starting from that banging intro song, you're absolutely in for a good time. I wasn't even thought of yet, and I can both see and love those MTV vibes people say this one has. It might be a detriment to the stronger cinematic pros of the original to put this one in first purely due to its higher entertainment value, but that's just my taste. Getting right to it, yeah, this does kill off some characters from the last movie, but with what I said about that last movie, it didn't really affect me as I didn't share any strong emotional connection to them. But the new characters that replace them are some of my favorites. Most of all, I really love the new lead, Alice. To be completely honest, even though there are strengths and qualities that I might prefer in both, I genuinely love her as much as I do Nancy. I haven't got the chance to meet her yet, but I especially love the energy that Lisa Wilcox brings to the character, and how she's written. Even more, I also love the new character of Dan, as well as, of course, the romance he forms with Alice, which almost feels right out of, here it goes, Disney Channel, which yes, this movie has plenty of the vibes of. Anyway, I think that Alice and Dan might just be the strongest couple I've ever seen in a horror movie. With that in mind, and what really makes me love this movie the most out of the others, especially more than the original, is how this is the first, and probably only now that I think about it, to actually have a happy ending. Look, while this might just be an average middle-of-the-road slasher movie that especially doesn't have the stronger themes of the previous movies, this one nonetheless feels like a culmination. Where those previous movies do have those stronger themes, yes, I think they're often downplayed by those downer endings, but here we get such a well-deserved victory that in many ways does those said previous endings justice. That's what makes this one not just my comfort nightmare movie, but one of my favorite comfort horror movies in general that has the most rewatchability factor, and that's the biggest reason it just had to come first. I really had to trust my gut here, but I hope that, whether you agree or not, I was at least able to make you see to my points. And that was my ranking of the entire Nightmare on Elm Street franchise. If you got through all the hot takes, I hope you enjoyed or at least got something out of this video. Again, I'd really love to hear your thoughts or even some of your hot takes. But let's just be respectful. Up next, I'll be looking at and ranking the Chucky franchise. Until then, this has been Daniel. Like, comment, subscribe, and most importantly, keep loving movies.